Imagine building a billion-dollar empire with your own hands, only to return years later and be treated like invisible garbage in your own lobby. Imagine being the smartest person in the room, holding the keys to the kingdom, yet being mocked and humiliated simply because you're holding a mop. This isn't just a story about a disguised boss, it is a brutal collision between the arrogance of the elite and the quiet power of the truth. We have all felt that stinging moment when someone looks right through you, judging your worth by your clothes or your job title. It is a universal pain, the feeling that kindness has become a weakness in a world that rewards cruelty. It makes you question if decency even matters anymore. Enter Antony Gibbs, a CEO who goes undercover as a janitor to find the rot in his company. He expects to find laziness, but he finds a toxic nightmare. But in the darkness, he discovers a single spark of light: Rochelle, an overworked employee who risks her career to defend a nobody. You are about to witness a journey that goes from heartbreaking humiliation to the most satisfying, explosive vindication you have ever seen. But this is more than a test of character. When a catastrophic system failure threatens to bankrupt the entire corporation, the arrogant managers who mocked the janitor are brought to their knees. As the clock ticks down and panic sets in, they realize too late that the only person who can save them is the man they just tried to destroy. If you believe that character is the only qualification that truly matters, you have found your home. Join our growing family of storytellers by hitting that subscribe button. Smash the like button to stand with the underdogs, and share this video to spread the message. Now, let's watch the arrogance crumble. Antony Gibbs stood before the tarnished mirror of the basement locker room, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the collar of a gray, stained uniform that smelled of industrial bleach and forgotten dreams. He was shedding the skin of the revered company founder, a man whose mere whisper could shift stock markets, to inhabit the invisible, ghost-like shell of a janitor. This transformation into an undercover billionaire was not a whim of eccentricity but a desperate surgical strike to diagnose the rot eating his legacy alive. He needed to witness the office drama from the ground floor, stripping away the polished presentations of his board to see the raw, unfiltered truth. His hidden identity was his only shield against the sycophants who had surrounded him for decades, hiding the toxic reality that was festering within the company's glass walls. Pushing his cleaning cart out of the service elevator, Antony felt a jarring shift in the atmosphere, as if he had stepped into a parallel dimension where he no longer existed as a human being. The grand lobby, with its marble floors he had personally selected, was bustling with employees who looked through him as if he were made of glass. This social experiment was proving to be more painful than he anticipated. The isolation of the secret boss was immediate and crushing. He watched young executives, people whose salaries he paid, sneer at the security guards or drop coffee cups on the floor without breaking stride, expecting the help to clean it up. It was a stark introduction to the caste system he had unknowingly presided over, a world where title dictated worth and the unnoticed were treated as furniture. He made his way to the elevators, keeping his head low and his cap pulled down to obscure his eyes, the only feature that might betray his true persona to a sharp observer. Two vice presidents stepped in with him, pressing the button for the penthouse floor while continuing a conversation that made Antony's blood run cold. They were joking about trimming the fat and cutting benefits for the support staff to boost their quarterly bonuses, oblivious to the CEO standing inches away. Antony gripped the handle of his mop until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to remain silent while absorbing every toxic word. This was the true character of his leadership team, revealed only when they thought no one of consequence was listening, a betrayal that stung worse than any declining stock graph. Arriving at the engineering floor, Antony began the monotonous rhythm of mopping, a physical labor he hadn't performed in 40 years, yet the physical strain paled in comparison to the emotional toll. He observed the cliques forming near the water cooler, the exclusionary whispers, and the palpable tension that hung over the cubicles like a storm cloud. He saw brilliance being stifled by bureaucracy and intimidation, realizing that the office drama was not just petty gossip but a systemic poison destroying innovation. As an undercover billionaire, he was gathering evidence for a reckoning, but in the moment, he felt powerless, just a witness to the slow disintegration of his life's work. The judged employees worked in fear, while the incompetent managers strutted with unearned confidence, creating a volatile environment poised for collapse. He decided to test the humanity of his staff with a simple ruse, struggling intentionally with a heavy trash bag that had snagged on a desk corner near the busy break room. It was a silent kindness test, a plea for basic assistance that went unanswered by dozens of passing employees who were too self-absorbed to notice an old man's struggle. They walked past him with eyes glued to their smartphones or laughed loudly at private jokes, reinforcing the rich man-poor woman dynamic where the poor in status were invisible to the rich in arrogance. Antony felt a profound sense of regret washing over him. Had he created this culture of indifference? By focusing so much on profits and growth, had he neglected the human element that was the true foundation of any great enterprise? The realization that he was completely alone in his own building was a bitter pill to swallow, fueling a growing fire of indignation within his chest. He was learning a hard life lesson that no business school could teach. Power isolates, but the lack of it exposes the true nature of those around you. He continued his rounds, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of decency, any spark of the values he thought his company represented. He needed to find an ally, or at least a reason to believe that the entire organization wasn't lost to selfishness and greed. His hidden identity allowed him to see the cracks in the foundation, but he feared that the damage might already be structural and irreversible, threatening to bring the whole tower down. Just as his hope was beginning to fade into the gray monotony of the carpet, he noticed a young woman working quietly in a corner, her desk piled high with files that weren't hers. While others postured and networked, she was focused, her brow furrowed in concentration as she fixed errors she clearly hadn't made. This was his first glimpse of Rochelle James, though he didn't know her name yet. He only saw a solitary figure of diligence in a sea of negligence. Antony paused his mopping, watching her with the intense scrutiny of a company founder looking for a diamond in the rough. He didn't know it yet, but this unnoticed employee was about to become the pivot point of his entire investigation, the catalyst for a vindication that would shake the company to its core. The morning rush in the corporate headquarters was a chaotic ballet of ambition and caffeine, a spectacle Antony watched from the sidelines of his cleaning cart. As the janitor, he navigated the sea of tailored suits and clicking heels, feeling the palpable disdain radiating from the workforce he had hired. He was an obstacle in their path to success, a gray smudge on their otherwise pristine day, and the office drama played out in their aggressive sighs and eye rolls whenever he paused to sweep a speck of dust. Antony felt the weight of his hidden identity pressing down on him. He was the CEO in disguise, yet he had never felt less powerful or more invisible than he did in that moment, surrounded by the cold indifference of his own creation. Disaster struck near the elevators when a distracted VP, engrossed in a phone call about his stock options, clipped the edge of Antony's cart with his briefcase. The impact sent the mop bucket tipping over, unleashing a tidal wave of gray, soapy water across the polished marble floor of the lobby. The sound of the crash silenced the room for a heartbeat, followed immediately by the VP's loud scoff of annoyance as he inspected his dry shoes, muttering about incompetent idiots before storming off. Antony fell to his knees, his face burning with a mix of shame and anger, frantically trying to stem the tide with paper towels as the unnoticed servants often do. He felt the eyes of the lobby on him, not with sympathy, but with the annoyance of people whose path had been inconvenienced. Dozens of employees walked past the spreading puddle, skirting the edges like it was toxic waste, offering no help, only judgmental glares. This was the ultimate kindness test, and his company was failing it with spectacular cruelty. The culture of every man for himself was on full display. Antony's heart sank as he realized the depth of the rot. There was no camaraderie here, only a collection of mercenaries fighting for their own survival. He was just about to resign himself to the task when a pair of worn, sensible sneakers stopped directly in the path of the water, breaking the stream of indifference. Rochelle James didn't hesitate. She dropped her bag on a dry patch of floor and knelt beside him, heedless of her office attire. "Here, let me help you with that," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the lobby like a clear bell, warm and devoid of the condescension he had grown used to. She grabbed a handful of napkins from her purse and started soaking up the spill, working shoulder to shoulder with the old janitor. Antony looked at her in shock, his undercover billionaire persona momentarily shaken by this act of unsolicited grace from a woman who clearly had nothing to gain from helping him. "You don't have to do this, miss," Antony mumbled, keeping his head down to maintain his cover, though his eyes were fixed on her hands working quickly alongside his. "You'll get in trouble if you ruin your clothes." Rochelle just smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes, and shook her head. "It's just water, Tony. Besides, I've had days like this. Nobody should have to clean up a mess alone while everyone else just watches." Her words struck a chord deep within him. She was the first person to treat him as a human being rather than a function, passing the true character test that everyone else had failed. They worked in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, an island of cooperation in a sea of selfishness, while the rich man-poor woman dynamic played out in reverse. She was rich in spirit, while the executives passing by were morally bankrupt. Antony noted the fray on her sleeves and the tired lines around her eyes, signs of a worker who gave more than she received, yet she still found energy to help a stranger. This wasn't a performance for a performance review. There were no managers watching, no cameras rolling. This was simply who she was, a person who couldn't walk past a problem or a person in need, even if it meant risking her own dignity in the eyes of the corporate elite. As they finished and Antony lifted the bucket back onto the cart, he felt a lump in his throat that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. "Thank you," he said, infusing the words with as much sincerity as he dared without breaking character. Rochelle stood up, brushing off her knees, and gave him a conspiratorial wink. "Anytime. We have to look out for each other in here, right?" She grabbed her bag and merged back into the crowd, leaving Antony staring after her. He had found a spark in the darkness, a single beacon of hope that suggested his company might still be worth saving, all thanks to the girl who stopped for the janitor. The warmth of the interaction with Rochelle had barely settled in Antony's chest when a shadow fell over the scene, chilling the air instantly. Rochelle had just returned to her desk, still wiping the last of the soap from her hands, when her manager, a man named Sterling who prided himself on ruthless efficiency, loomed over her. The entire office seemed to hold its breath as the office drama shifted from passive observation to active hostility. Antony, lingering nearby under the pretense of polishing a glass partition, watched as Sterling tapped his expensive watch, his face twisted into a mask of disdain that signaled the judged verdict he was about to deliver. "Ms. James," Sterling's voice boomed, loud enough to ensure every head on the floor turned to witness the humiliation. "I wasn't aware that your job description had been updated to include assistant janitor. If you have so much free time to play in dirty water with the help, perhaps I haven't given you enough work." The insult was designed to be a public execution of her dignity, a clear signal to everyone else that empathy was a weakness to be punished. Rochelle shrank into her chair, her face flushing a deep crimson, not out of shame for her actions, but from the stinging injustice of being humiliated for showing basic human decency. "I was just helping him for a moment, sir." "He spilled a bucket and no one else was stopping," Rochelle replied, her voice trembling slightly but retaining a core of steel. "It only took 2 minutes." Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound that grated on Antony's nerves and made his fists clench around his spray bottle. "2 minutes you stole from the company," Sterling sneered, leaning in closer to invade her personal space. "We don't pay you to be a Samaritan, Rochelle. We pay you to code. Leave the garbage to the people who are paid to handle garbage." The derogatory way he referred to Antonia's garbage sent a shockwave of cold fury through the undercover billionaire. He had built this company on principles of mutual respect, and seeing this middle management tyrant twisted into a hierarchy of abuse was sickening. Antony watched from his vantage point, his hidden identity the only thing keeping him from marching over and firing Sterling on the spot. He saw the other employees duck their heads, terrified of drawing Sterling's ire, complicit in their silence. This was the toxic culture that was strangling his business, a place where kindness was ridiculed and cruelty was mistaken for leadership. Rochelle bit her lip, holding back tears of frustration, but she didn't apologize for her kindness, which Antony noted with a surge of respect. "I understand, sir," she said quietly, choosing to de-escalate rather than give him more ammunition. "It won't impact my deadlines." Sterling smirked, satisfied that he had crushed her spirit, or so he thought. "See that it doesn't. And stay away from the janitor. You're already on thin ice. Don't make me think you belong in the basement with him." He spun on his heel and marched back to his office, leaving a trail of anxiety in his wake. Antony felt a profound sense of regret for putting her in this position. His social experiment had made her a target. He met her eyes across the room for a fleeting second, trying to convey a silent apology and a promise of vindication that he couldn't yet voice. Rochelle offered him a weak, sad smile, shrugging her shoulders as if to say, "It's not your fault." That simple gesture, protecting his feelings even while she was bleeding emotionally, solidified her status in his mind. She was the unsung hero of this floor, a flower trying to bloom in a pot full of acid. The incident established the battlefield clearly in Antony's mind. It was no longer just about numbers or code, it was a war for the soul of the company. Sterling represented everything that had gone wrong: the arrogance, the cruelty, the dehumanization of the worker. Rochelle represented the forgotten heart of the enterprise, the true character, the resilience, the empathy. As the secret boss, Antony knew he had to let this play out to catch Sterling in a fireable offense, but waiting was becoming the hardest thing he had ever done. He resumed his cleaning, but his movements were sharper now, fueled by a determination to see justice done for the woman who had been ridiculed for her humanity. Night had descended over the city, turning the office windows into dark mirrors that reflected the empty desks of the staff who had long since clocked out. Antony, continuing his charade as the tireless janitor, moved through the silent aisles, emptying trash bins and observing the ghost town that was his headquarters after 6 p.m. Yet, in the sea of darkness, one cubicle remained illuminated, a lonely island of industry in a deserted ocean. It was Rochelle, still at her desk, bathed in the blue glow of her monitors, surrounded by takeout containers and stacks of technical documentation that didn't belong to her department. The undercover billionaire pushed his cart softly, stopping in the shadows to observe what she was doing with such intense focus. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the code on her screen. It wasn't her assigned work. She was methodically going through the commits made by the senior engineering team, the rockstars who spent half the day bragging and the other half delegating, and she was fixing their sloppy mistakes. She was debugging a critical memory leak that the lead architect had ignored, rewriting functions to be more efficient, all while the people who would take credit for this work were likely at a bar or asleep. Antony approached her desk, making a deliberate noise with his broom so as not to startle her too much. "You're burning the midnight oil again, Miss Rochelle," he said, his voice raspy and kind. Rochelle jumped slightly, then relaxed, seeing the friendly face of the old man. "Oh, hey Tony. Yeah, just tying up some loose ends before the big update." She rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but her eyes remained bright with determination. She wasn't doing this for overtime pay. Knew Sterling wouldn't approve it. Was doing it because she cared about the product. "Seems like a lot of work for one person," Antony commented, fishing for the truth. "Isn't that Mr. Henderson's module?" Rochelle hesitated, then sighed, too tired to maintain the corporate veil. "It is. But if I don't patch it, the system will crash when we go live. He overlooks things sometimes. I just want to make sure we don't let the clients down." She said it without malice, simply stating a fact. She was the unnoticed glue holding the department together, covering for the incompetence of her superiors to protect the company's reputation. This was a profound life lesson for Antony. He had been paying huge salaries to the wrong people, while the person adding the most value was being treated like a liability. He felt a surge of protectiveness and a desire to reveal his hidden identity right there, to tell her that her true character was being watched by the only pair of eyes that mattered. "You're a good person, Rochelle," he said softly. "They are lucky to have you, even if they're too blind to see it." She smiled sadly. "Thanks, Tony. Sometimes it feels like I'm invisible, you know. Like I'm screaming underwater." "I see you," Antony said, and the double meaning hung heavy in the air. "And the good thing about the truth is that it always floats to the top eventually." He placed a fresh bottle of water on her desk, a small gesture of care from the janitor. "Don't stay too late. The company isn't worth your health." Rochelle nodded, taking the water gratefully. "It'll be done soon. Just a few more lines." She turned back to the screen, the unsung hero diving back into the trench warfare of code. Antony walked away, his heart heavy but his resolve hardened like steel. He had found the rot in the seniors and the manager, but he had also found the cure in Rochelle. The rich man-poor woman dynamic was about to be flipped on its head. He knew that a crisis was inevitably coming. Bad code always leads to a crash, and when it did, he would be there to ensure that the credit went to the architect of the solution, not the architects of the problem. He checked his watch. The launch was in 2 days. The storm was approaching, and Rochelle was the only one building an ark. The day of the critical system update arrived with a deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a tsunami. The office was buzzing with nervous energy, the executives pacing the floor while the engineering team high-fived each other prematurely, confident in the work they hadn't actually done. Antony, blending into the background with his mop, felt the tension radiating from the server room. He knew, thanks to his observation of Rochelle, that the foundation was shaky, held together by the late-night patches of a single overworked analyst. The CEO inside him wanted to halt the launch, but the social experiment required the failure to happen to expose the frauds. At 10 a.m. sharp, the switch was flipped to migrate the live data to the new core. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then, the screens on the main dashboard flickered. Green status bars froze, then turned yellow, and finally, a catastrophic, blood red. A low hum of confusion swept through the room, escalating rapidly into a roar of panic as phones began to ring simultaneously. Angry clients, confused partners, and terrified stakeholders. The system hadn't just stalled, it had crashed completely, locking out millions of users and putting the entire corporation's assets at risk. What is happening? Why is it red? Sterling screamed, running out of his office like a man whose hair was on fire. Fix it. Fix it now. The office drama exploded into chaos. The arrogance of the senior engineers evaporated instantly, replaced by the sweaty sheen of terror. They typed furiously, shouting nonsensical jargon to cover their ignorance, but the red bars remained. They had no idea what was wrong because they hadn't written the core logic. They had relied on legacy code they didn't understand and patches they hadn't verified. Antony watched from the corner, gripping his cart. This was the nightmare scenario, a total system failure that threatened to bankrupt the company within hours if not resolved. The stock price, displayed on the break room TV, began a nosedive that made Antony's stomach churn. This wasn't just money losing value, it was jobs, livelihoods, and his entire legacy crumbling in real time. The secret boss was witnessing the ultimate consequence of a culture that prioritized ego over competence. The karma was delivering a harsh blow, but it was striking the whole ship, not just the captain. Rochelle was the only one not screaming. She sat at her desk, pale but focused, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she tried to diagnose the root cause. "It's a conflict in the kernel," she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the shouting. The legacy override didn't handshake with the new security protocol. She was speaking the language of the solution, but in the cacophony of panicked men, her voice was unnoticed. She tried to stand up. "Mr. Sterling. I think I know what." "Not now, Rochelle." Sterling barked, cutting her off without looking. "I need the senior team on this. Get out of the way." He shoved past her to yell at the lead architect, who was staring blankly at a blue screen of death. The irony was suffocating. The only person who could potentially staunch the bleeding was being silenced by the man who had slit the artery. Antony felt a surge of rage. The judged subordinate was being sidelined while the experts drove the bus off the cliff. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with the stench of impending doom. "We're losing data integrity," someone shouted. "Backups are failing." The life lesson was playing out in brutal high definition. When the tide goes out, you see who has been swimming naked. The entire leadership team was naked, exposed as frauds who could manage a meeting but couldn't manage a crisis. Antony knew he might have to intervene soon, blowing his cover to save the company, but he held back, waiting for the breaking point. The crash was the fire that would burn away the dead wood, and he needed to see if Rochelle could survive the flames. The atmosphere in the engineering bay, usually a sanctuary of smug superiority and hushed typing, had devolved into a frantic pit of despair that smelled of sweat and fear. The so-called A-team of developers, men who boasted about their Ivy League degrees and leased luxury cars on the promise of future bonuses, were now huddled around the main console like confused children. Their voices, once confident and dismissive, were now shrill with panic, lacking any real direction or leadership. "It's a hardware issue," one insisted, trying to shift the blame to infrastructure. "No, it's a DDoS attack," shouted another, grasping for an external enemy to explain their internal failure. Antony, the janitor standing invisibly in the corner, shook his head imperceptibly. They were guessing, throwing darts in the dark because they didn't understand the light. On the large monitors mounted on the wall, the consequences of their incompetence were playing out in real time on the global stage. The news channel had broken into its regular programming with a breaking news banner: "Tech giant goes dark." The cheer-in flashed red, mirroring the catastrophic dashboard of the server room. The undercover billionaire watched his net worth dip by digits that would represent lifetimes of earnings for the people in this room, yet the money was the least of his concerns. He was witnessing the destruction of his reputation, the brand he had built from a garage into an empire, now being dragged through the mud by men who didn't know how to fix a problem they had created. Sterling, the manager, was pacing back and forth, sweating through his expensive dress shirt, his eyes darting around the room for a solution that wasn't coming. "I need a fix, not theories," he screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. He turned to the lead engineer, a man who had ignored Antony for weeks and treated Rochelle like a coffee girl. "Do something. Anything." The engineer looked defeated, his arrogance stripped away to reveal a hollow core. I don't know the core logic. It's legacy stuff. Nobody knows how that part of the kernel works." It was a confession of intellectual laziness. They had built their careers on top of a foundation they never bothered to understand. Rochelle, meanwhile, was sidelined in the most brutal fashion, her attempts to help drowned out by the noise of male egos crashing. She had tried to speak up, suggesting a rollback protocol based on her earlier findings, but she was aggressively shushed. "Quiet, Rochelle. The adults are talking," the lead engineer had snapped at her, a frantic attempt to maintain his crumbling authority. Antony felt a surge of vindication mixed with fury. The adults were driving the car off a cliff while the only person with a map was gagged in the back seat. It was a perfect microcosm of the rich man poor woman struggle. Those rich in power were poor in skill, while she was the opposite. The panic was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. People were calling their spouses in hushed tones, whispering about layoffs, bankruptcy, and lost pensions. The illusion of corporate security was shattered, replaced by the raw, primal fear of survival. Antony saw the terror in the eyes of the support staff, the admins, the people who lived paycheck to paycheck and had nothing to do with the code. They were the ones who would suffer most from this incompetence, the collateral damage of the office drama. The social experiment had yielded its darkest result. The leadership was morally and technically bankrupt, and they were taking the village down with them. "We have to wipe the servers," Sterling announced suddenly, a desperate, foolish idea born of ignorance. "Start from scratch. Reboot the whole architecture." Rochelle gasped, standing up from her chair. "No. You'll lose the client archives. You can't do that." She looked around wildly, seeking support. "There has to be another way. A wipe is irreversible." The room fell silent, turning to look at her with disdain. Who was she to question the strategy in the middle of a war zone? But Antony knew she was right. Wiping the servers was suicide. Antony moved imperceptibly closer to the center of the room, gripping his mop handle like a staff. He knew wiping the servers would kill the company to save the manager's ego for a few hours. He was watching a train wreck in slow motion, fueled by the true character of a leadership team that would rather burn the building down than admit they didn't know how to put out the fire. The countdown to total failure was accelerating, the stock ticker was bleeding red, and the janitor was the only one in the room who saw the cliff edge approaching. He adjusted his cap. The time for observation was ending. The tension in the room finally snapped like an over-tightened violin string. Sterling, fueled by blind panic and the crushing weight of the plummeting stock price, needed a physical outlet for his impotence. When Rochelle dared to object to the server wipe, questioning his command in front of his failing troops, he turned on her like a cornered animal. But as he stormed toward her desk to silence her, his expensive Italian loafer caught on the wheel of Antony's mop bucket, the same bucket that had always been invisible to him because he refused to see the person pushing it. "You stupid idiot!" Sterling roared, losing all semblance of professional composure. He kicked the metal trash can violently, sending it flying across the room where it crashed into the drywall inches from Antony's head. The loud clang echoed like a gunshot in the silent office, freezing everyone in place. Antony didn't flinch. He stood his ground, gripping his broom, staring calmly at the man who was unraveling before his eyes. The janitor was used to being invisible, but now he was a target, the punching bag for a millionaire's frustration. "Get out of my way! Why are you even here?" Sterling screamed, his face contorted into a mask of ugly rage. He raised a hand as if to shove Antony aside, a physical violation of the boundary between executive and staff. The room gasped. Attacking a member of the cleaning crew was a new low, even for a tyrant like Sterling. But before the hand could connect with Antony's gray uniform, a small figure stepped swiftly in between them, acting as a human shield. It was Rochelle. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice shaking with adrenaline but firm with moral conviction. She stood with her arms spread, shielding the undercover billionaire with her own body. "He didn't do anything. You're angry at the situation, don't take it out on him." It was a shocking display of bravery in a room full of powerful men. The lowest paid analyst was the only one with the courage to stand up to the bully. This was a workplace romance of a different kind, not of lovers, but of a deep, protective loyalty to the vulnerable. Sterling paused, stunned by her defiance, his hand hovering in the air. "You're defending the janitor?" he scoffed, his eyes wide with incredulity, as if she were defending a piece of office equipment. "While the company burns, you're playing hero for the help." Rochelle didn't back down, her chin held high. "I'm defending a human being, Mr. Sterling. Something you seem to have forgotten how to be." The words hung in the air, heavy and true, stripping Sterling of his authority more effectively than any board vote could. Antony felt a swell of pride so intense it almost brought tears to his eyes behind his disguise. She was risking everything: her job, her reputation, her future for him, for a nobody. This was the ultimate kindness test, and she had just set the curve for the entire human race. Antony looked at the back of her head, seeing the trembling in her shoulders. She was terrified, but she stood fast because her values were stronger than her fear. He realized then that she was the leader this company deserved, possessing the spine that every man in a suit in that room lacked. Sterling sneered, straightening his jacket in a pathetic attempt to regain dignity. "Fine. If you love the garbage so much, maybe you belong with it." He turned his back on them, dismissing her humanity as easily as he dismissed the server alerts. But the dynamic had shifted. The staff watched Rochelle with wide eyes, a seed of respect planted in the scorched earth of the crisis. Antony placed a gentle, calloused hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered. She looked back, eyes wet but fierce. "I hate bullies," she muttered. At that moment, the hidden identity of the janitor felt like a lie he could no longer sustain. He owed her the truth. Topic 8: The Secret Code. The chaos resumed, louder and more desperate than before, as Sterling returned to the console to initiate the fatal server wipe. Rochelle slumped back into her chair, the adrenaline fading to leave her exhausted and defeated. Antony, however, was no longer looking at the floor or his mop. He was looking at the main screen, where lines of cascading error codes were scrolling too fast for the young engineers to read. But Antony could read them. He saw the pattern in the chaos. He saw the heartbeat of the code he had written in his dorm room 30 years ago, the foundational DNA of the company. He realized with a jolt that the solution wasn't in the new patches, the cloud interface, or the modern frameworks these kids were obsessed with. The problem was deep in the kernel, a conflict with a failsafe he had embedded decades ago for exactly this kind of catastrophic loop. It was a sequence of commands, a backdoor key that only the company founder knew. It was a piece of knowledge that had died with the original development team, leaving only him as the keeper of the flame, the ghost in the machine who knew the secret language of the system. As the engineers prepared to execute the command that would destroy the data, Antony felt the crushing weight of the moment. If he stayed silent, his disguise would be safe, but his legacy would be ash, and thousands of people would lose their jobs. If he acted, the social experiment would end, and the janitor would be exposed, potentially shattering the trust he was trying to rebuild. He looked at Rochelle, wiping her eyes, mourning the death of the work she loved. He looked at Sterling, sweating with incompetence and malice. The life lesson was staring him in the face. Silence in the face of destruction is complicity. He moved closer to the whiteboard that dominated the main wall of the war room. It was covered in frantic, useless scribbles from the engineering team, wrong equations, dead ends, and panic-induced gibberish. He felt the marker in his pocket, a distinct weight against his leg. He knew the syntax he needed to write. It was elegant, simple, and ancient in computer terms. It was the only thing that could stop the bleeding. The realization hit him with clarity: they can't fix it because they don't respect it. They treated the company as a money printer, not a living organism with a history and a logic. Antony understood the ghost in the machine because he was the ghost. The secret boss had to become the savior, not for the stock price or the shareholders, but for the truth of the work itself. He had to show them that the past they ignored was the only thing that could save their future. He watched the countdown on the big screen. Initiating wipe in 10 minutes. The room felt like a funeral home. People were packing their bags, mentally writing their resumes. The air was thick with regret. Antony took a deep breath, inhaling the stale air of the office one last time as a nobody. He had waited to see if anyone else could step up, if anyone else had the brilliance or the intuition to solve the puzzle. But the room was empty of heroes, save for the girl who had defended him, and she was locked out of the system. He stepped away from his cart, leaving the bucket behind. His posture changed instantly. The slouch of the tired cleaner vanished, replaced by the commanding verticality of a CEO who had faced down giants. He walked toward the whiteboard, his eyes locked on the empty space in the center. It was time. The shocking reveal was no longer a choice, it was a necessity driven by duty. He uncapped the marker in his mind before he even touched it. Wait. Sterling's voice cut through the panic, but not to offer a solution. He was looking for a sacrificial lamb, a body to throw to the wolves of the board of directors. The stocks had hit rock bottom, and his phone was blowing up with calls from the chairman. Someone had to bleed for this disaster, and it certainly wasn't going to be him. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the easiest, most vulnerable target, the woman who had just publicly humiliated him by defending the janitor. Rochelle. This is your code block, isn't it? The one that failed? It was a blatant, clumsy lie. Everyone in the room knew Rochelle hadn't touched the kernel. She didn't even have access permissions for that level of the system. But in the office drama of survival, truth is the first casualty. What? No. Rochelle stood up, shocked to her core. I didn't even have access to that repository. You know that. Sterling wasn't listening to facts, he was crafting a narrative for the shareholders. Incompetence and insubordination, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. You compromised the system with your unauthorized patches. The room went deathly silent. The other engineers, the ones actually responsible for the sloppy integration, looked at their shoes, cowards to the bone. They were letting the judged woman take the fall to save their own bonuses and reputations. It was a disgusting display of corporate cannibalism, a pack of hyenas turning on the wounded member. Pack your things, Sterling spat, his face twisted with malicious triumph. You're fired. Get out of my building before I call security and have you dragged out. Rochelle gasped, the color draining from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. You can't do this. I tried to help. I warned you. Her voice broke into a sob. To be fired in the middle of a crisis she tried to prevent, accused of the very error she tried to fix, was a cruelty beyond words. Antony felt a cold fury settle in his gut, a dangerous calm before the storm. This was the humiliated peak of the experiment, the moment where the villain reveals his true nature completely. "And take your janitor friend with you," Sterling sneered, glancing at Antony with pure loathing. "Since you like working with garbage so much, you can both leave. I don't want to see either of you on this floor ever again." He turned back to the phone, already rehearsing his lie to the directors. "I found the culprit, a rogue analyst, we are handling it." The injustice was palpable, a physical weight that made the air hard to breathe. Rochelle began to cry openly, a quiet, heartbroken sound that tore at Antony's soul. She reached for her bag, her hands trembling so hard she dropped her keys on the carpet. No one moved to help her picking them up. The team she had saved a dozen times watched her drown in Sterling's lies. Antony stood motionless, his eyes drilling holes into the back of the manager's head. The karma bucket was full and overflowing. The debt was due. He realized that firing her was Sterling's fatal mistake. He had just severed the last thread of decency in the room, the last reason for Antony to show any mercy. Antony looked at Rochelle, seeing the devastation of a good person crushed by a bad system. The time for observation was over. The undercover billionaire had seen enough. The rot wasn't just in the walls or the coat, it was sitting in the corner office, wearing a tie. Rochelle walked slowly toward the elevator banks, clutching a small cardboard box that contained the meager sum of her professional Lithia potted plant, a chipped mug, and the framed photo of her mother. Each step she took was a struggle against the crushing gravity of injustice, her heels clicking a mournful rhythm on the linoleum. She wasn't just losing a paycheck, she was losing her faith in the concept of fairness itself. The sound of her stifled sobs echoed in the cavernous quiet that followed Sterling's outburst, a sound that sliced through the air like a razor. Antony watched her go, and a profound, sickening wave of regret washed over him, heavier than any burden he had carried as a CEO. He realized with a sharp pang of guilt that he had waited too long to intervene. In his obsessive desire to test the true character of his team, he had allowed an innocent soldier to be wounded on the battlefield of his social experiment. He had treated people like variables in an equation, forgetting that they bleed when cut. He was the company founder, the omnipotent owner, yet he had stood by in his disguise while his best employee was executed socially by a tyrant. The life lesson was harsh and immediate. Inaction in the face of evil is not neutrality, it is a form of active cruelty. "Rochelle, wait," he called out, his voice dropping the raspy, subservient accent he had affected for weeks. It was the voice of Antony Gibbs, clear, authoritative, and commanding, though no one in the room recognized it yet. She stopped, her shoulders shaking, and turned to look at him through eyes swimming with tears. "It's okay, Tony," she choked out, trying to smile for him even now. "You stay. You need the job. Don't get fired for me. Please, just keep your head down." Even in her lowest moment, stripped of her dignity, she was trying to protect the janitor. Her selflessness broke him completely. He looked around the room at the faces of the engineers and staff who stayed silent, eyes averted. He saw their shame, but he also saw their relief that the lightning had struck her and not them. They were sheep led by a wolf, paralyzed by the office drama and the fear of unemployment. Antony realized that saving the company's bottom line meant nothing if he couldn't save the people like Rochelle who actually gave it a soul. The rich man-poor woman divide was bridged by shared pain in that moment, but he knew he had the power to burn that bridge down. He walked toward her, leaving his cleaning cart abandoned in the middle of the hallway like a forgotten prop. "You didn't fail, Rochelle," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pause. "They failed you. This entire building failed you." Rochelle shook her head, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "It doesn't matter, Tony. It's over. Sterling wins. He always wins." She pressed the elevator button repeatedly, desperate to escape the scene of her humiliation, to vanish into the anonymous streets below. But the light above the elevator didn't illuminate. The system failure had triggered a building-wide lockdown protocol. The elevators were frozen. They were trapped on the floor with the very people who had betrayed them. The universe was conspiring to keep them there, forcing a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Antony took it as a sign he couldn't let her leave with this memory as the final chapter. He couldn't let the last thing she saw be the triumph of a bully. He looked at Sterling, who was now screaming into a phone, blaming the IT vendor. He looked at Rochelle, defeated and cornered. And he looked at the whiteboard, where the solution to the crisis was burning in his mind like a neon sign. The tears on Rochelle's face were the fuel he needed to incinerate his hidden identity. The time for secrets was over. The undercover billionaire was about to step into the light, and he was bringing the fire with him. Security! Sterling screamed into the wall intercom, his voice cracking with hysteria. I have a disgruntled ex-employee refusing to vacate the premises. And a member of the cleaning staff is threatening me. Send backup now. The desperation in his voice was pathetic, the sound of a man losing control of his own narrative. He wanted Rochelle gone because her presence was a mirror reflecting his own cowardice, and he wanted Antony gone because the janitor was looking at him with eyes that held too much judgment. Two burly guards appeared at the glass doors of the wing, looking confused and out of breath. The situation felt heavy, thick with the smog of office drama and despair. Rochelle backed against the wall, terrified by the escalation. I'm leaving, I'm trying to leave. She pleaded, clutching her box tighter. The elevators aren't working. The guards advanced, hands on their belts, following orders from the man in the expensive suit. It was a scene of total hopelessness. The system was dead, the stock was zero, the innocent were being persecuted as criminals, and the guilty were presiding over the ashes. It was the darkest hour of the night. Antony felt the adrenaline surge, a cold clarity settling over his mind. This was the bottom, the absolute nadir. The janitor disguise felt suffocating now, a costume that had served its purpose but was now a cage. He saw the guards reach for Rochelle's arm to forcibly escort her. Don't touch her, Antony said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the icy calm of a man who owned the ground they stood on. The voice carried a resonance that made the guards pause mid-step, looking at the old cleaner in confusion. Get back to your mop, old man, Sterling sneered, emboldened by the arrival of muscle. Or you're leaving in handcuffs too. Do you hear me? You're nothing. The threat hung in the air, toxic and sharp. The idea of vindication seemed impossible in the face of such entrenched power dynamics. Who would listen to a cleaner over a vice president? The engineers watched, paralyzed by the spectacle, witnessing a tragedy and doing absolutely nothing to stop it. Rochelle looked at Antony, her eyes begging him to stop, to save himself. Tony, please. It's not worth it. Don't fight them. She didn't know who he was. She thought he was throwing away his meager livelihood just to defend her honor. That made her cry harder, the guilt of causing him trouble compounding her misery. The true character of this woman was shining so bright it hurt to look at. Even as she was being dragged out, she was worried about the janitor's pension. The guards took another step, uncertain but compelled by duty. Sterling checked his watch, sweat dripping onto the console. 5 minutes until the auto wipe, the screen flashed. It was the end. The absolute point of no return. Everything Antony had built, the code, the culture, the dignity of the brand, was about to be erased by a script of incompetence. But in stories, as in life, the lowest point is the springboard for the ascent. Antony looked at the whiteboard again. The complex problem that had stumped the geniuses was actually a simple loop error he had predicted in 1999. He knew exactly what to do. He stepped away from Rochelle, not to abandon her, but to save her. He turned his back on the guards. Let her go, he said calmly, walking toward the center of the room. And watch. Antony walked past the guards, past the screaming Sterling, and past the stunned Rochelle. He didn't walk with the shuffle of a tired janitor anymore. He walked with the predatory stride of a lion entering its territory, his spine straight, his head high. He picked up a black marker from the conference table, the sound of the cap popping off echoing in the silent room like a pistol slide racking. It was a sound that signaled the shift in power, a declaration of war against incompetence. "What are you doing? Put that down!" Sterling yelled, his face purple. "Security, grab him. He's vandalizing the property." But the guards hesitated. There was something in the way Antony moved confidence that didn't belong to a man in a jumpsuit, an aura of authority that transcended clothing. He ignored them all, as if they were ghosts. He stepped up to the massive whiteboard, wiping away the useless equations of the engineering team with his sleeve, clearing the canvas for the truth. He began to write. It wasn't gibberish. It was code. High-level, syntactic, elegant C. The marker squeaked rhythmically against the board, a staccato drumbeat of logic. Void override _kernel _panic. The speed was incredible that he wasn't thinking, he was remembering that he was writing the source code of the company's soul, accessing memory banks that hadn't been touched in decades. The undercover billionaire was channeling the genius that had made him a legend, the raw talent that had built the skyscrapers Sterling merely occupied. The engineers gasped. Point one of them, the lead developer who had been so arrogant earlier, squinted at the board. Wait. That's a pointer to the root directory. How does he know that variable name? The room shifted from mockery to confusion, and then to a terrified awe that the janitor was writing code that none of them could even parse, utilizing functions and calls that were deep in the bedrock of the system. It was like watching a gardener step into an operating room and perform perfect open-heart surgery. Stop him, he's crazy, Sterling shrieked, too stupid to understand what was happening, terrified by the loss of control. But the lead engineer held up a hand, silencing his boss. Wait. Shut up. Let him finish. A hush fell over the room, absolute and reverent. The shocking reveal was happening in real-time. Antony's hand flew, connecting logic gates, bypassing the corrupted sectors, weaving a digital tapestry that only he could see. Rochelle watched, her mouth slightly open, her tears drying on her cheeks. She recognized the style. It was the same elegant, efficient logic she strove for in her own work. She looked at the back of the man she thought she knew. The gray hair, the stooped shoulders, they were an illusion. He stood tall now, dominating the room with sheer intellectual force, the whiteboard becoming his throne. Antony didn't stop until the board was full. He was rewriting the future of the company in black ink. He was proving that true character and skill can hide in the humblest of packages. He wrote the final closing brace and capped the marker with a decisive click. He turned to the lead engineer, holding out the marker like a baton passed from a master to a student. Type that. Line 402. Execute. Now. The lead engineer stared at the board, then at the janitor, then back at the board. The code was beautiful. It was a symphony of logic that solved a puzzle they hadn't even understood was a puzzle. Trembling, the engineer sat at the main console, his hands shaking as he hovered over the keys. He began to type, transcribing the scribbles from the whiteboard into the terminal. Sterling was apoplectic, vibrating with rage. If you crash the system further, I will bury you, I will sue you for everything you have. The room held its breath. The office drama had dissolved into pure, agonizing suspense. The engineer typed the final brace. He looked at Antony for confirmation. Antony nodded once, a sharp, commanding dip of his chin. The engineer hit enter. The sound of the key press seemed to echo like a thunderclap. A cursor blinked on the main screen. Once. Twice. Then, the red screens flashed. A loading bar appeared. Green text began to scroll rapidly, faster than the eye could follow. Kernel loop resolved. System restoring. Data integrity verified. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The dashboard, which had been a sea of blood-red failure, began to flip to green, block by block. Checks passing. Servers coming online. Money stopping its drain. The janitor had fixed the unfixable error in seconds. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. It was heavier than the panic had been. Sterling's jaw was literally on the floor, his face drained of color. Rochelle was staring at Antony as if he were a mythical creature who had just shed its skin. The guards lowered their hands, sensing that the dynamic had shifted tectonically. The impossible had just happened. A man who cleaned toilets had just outcoded the entire department and saved a billion-dollar corporation from ruin. Antony stood by the board, dusting chalk and ink off his hands, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sterling, who was shrinking into his suit. The system wasn't broken, Antony said, his voice calm, icy, and echoing with power. The leadership was. The words cut deeper than any knife, a verdict delivered by the supreme judge. The secret boss had spoken, and his judgment was absolute. The stocks on the TV screen ticked up, a green arrow replacing the red plummet. The crisis was over. But the reckoning was just beginning. The engineers looked at Antony with a mix of awe and terror, realizing they had been ignoring a master, mistreating the very source of their employment. The unnoticed man was suddenly the most powerful person in the room. Rochelle stepped forward, her voice a whisper in the silence. Tony. Who are you? She asked the question that was burning in everyone's mind. The life lesson had been delivered with sledgehammer force. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book owns the library. Antony turned to her, his eyes softening. The janitor was gone. The CEO had arrived. Antony smiled at Rochelle, a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Finally free of the mask of fatigue he had worn for weeks. He reached up with a slow, deliberate movement and peeled off the gray, sweat-stained cap that had covered his silver hair. He pulled a monogrammed handkerchief from his pocket silk, contrasting sharply with his polyester jumpsuit, and wiped away the smudge of grease he had artfully applied to his cheek every morning. He stood up to his full height, straightening his spine, and the transformation was subtle but absolute. The stooped, invisible janitor melted away like mist, and Antony Gibbs, the legendary company founder, stood revealed in the center of the room. A collective gasp went through the engineering bay like a shockwave, sucking the oxygen out of the air. Oh my God, a junior developer whispered, his face draining of color. It's Gibbs. It's the owner. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The man they had ignored, mocked, and treated as furniture was the man whose name was on the building. The shocking reveal was a sledgehammer to their egos and a terrifying wake-up call to their consciences. They had been performing a play of arrogance, unaware that the critic was sitting in the front row the entire time. Sterling turned a pale, sickly shade of gray, bracing himself against a desk to keep from collapsing. He had just tried to fire, humiliate, and arrest the man who signed his paychecks. The undercover billionaire plot had reached its climax, and Sterling was the villain caught in the spotlight. Mr. Gibbs, he squeaked, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know. I was just following protocol. I thought. Antony ignored him completely, treating his excuses as background noise. He walked straight to Rochelle, who was staring at him with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. I told you, Rochelle, Antony said softly, taking her trembling hands in his. You didn't fail. I needed to see who would stand up when the ship was sinking, and who would just try to save their own skin. You were the only one who grabbed a bucket. The room was spinning for everyone. The people who had been cruel were now trembling with fear, realizing their careers were likely over. The people who had been indifferent were now burning with shame. And the one person who had been kind was now standing hand in hand with the most powerful man in the industry. You were the cleaner, Rochelle stammered, trying to process the hidden identity that had fooled them all. I made you carry a bucket. I gave you water. Antony laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the silent room. And you helped me carry it when no one else would. That is why we are standing here, and why they are trembling. He turned to face the room, his expression hardening into stone. The CEO was back, and his patience for the office drama had evaporated completely. I built this company on innovation, yes, but also on respect, he announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room. Somewhere along the way, you turned it into a place of fear, arrogance, and exclusion. I had to become a janitor to remind you what real work looks like, and to see how you treat people you think can't do anything for you. He pointed to the whiteboard, still covered in his code. That code. That's the foundation. And you almost erased it because you were too proud to admit you didn't know the answer. You were ready to burn the history to hide your incompetence. The social experiment was concluded. The data was collected, and the verdict was damning. The rich man poor woman dynamic was now standing side by side, not as boss and employee, but as partners in truth. The power hierarchy had been inverted in seconds. The man in the jumpsuit was the king, and the men in the suits were the peasants who had failed their duties. Antony slowly turned his gaze to the manager, a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Sterling was shaking, sweating profusely, looking for anywhere to hide. Mr. Sterling, Antony said, his voice dangerously low and calm. You kicked the trash can at me. You insulted my staff. You tried to scapegoat an innocent woman to cover your own incompetence. And you almost bankrupted my company to save your ego. He listed the offenses methodically, Like a judge reading a sentence that you treated people as disposable. Today, you learn that no one is disposable. Sir. Please, I was under stress. The market. That I didn't mean. Sterling stammered, tears of panic welling in his eyes. Antony cut him off with a sharp gesture. Stress reveals character, Mr. Sterling. It doesn't create it. And yours is rotten to the core. Antony pointed to the glass doors. You are fired. Effective immediately. You will not receive a severance. You will not receive a reference. You will leave my building now. Before I have the security guards you called escort you out like the criminal you treated Ms. James as. The karma was instant, brutal, and satisfying. Sterling looked around the room for support, for anyone to speak up for him, but found only averted gazes. Even his allies, the rockstar engineers, turned away, desperate to distance themselves from the sinking ship. Sterling grabbed his jacket with shaking hands and slunk out of the room, a broken man, stripped of his power and his dignity. The air in the office instantly felt lighter, as if a toxic vent had been closed. The source of the poison had been removed. Antony then turned to the rest of the room. I apologize, he said, his tone shifting from anger to sorrow. I apologize that I let it get this bad. I apologize that I wasn't watching close enough. He looked at Rochelle, who was still wiping tears from her face. Especially to you, Rochelle, you were humiliated for doing the right thing. I am publicly apologizing for the behavior of this management team. It ends today. He bowed his head slightly to her, a gesture of immense respect from a CEO to a junior analyst, a breach of protocol that signaled a new era. Rochelle covered her mouth, fresh tears flowing. But this time they were tears of relief and validation. The vindication was total. She wasn't just cleared of wrongdoing, she was honored. In front of her tormentors. The judge had become the judge. You defended the weak, Antony continued, addressing the silent engineers. She valued the work over the credit. She valued the human over the profit. She is the only person in this room who understands what this company is supposed to be. The kindness test had a clear winner. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Character is the only qualification that truly matters. Skills can be taught. Decency cannot. The room remained silent, absorbing the weight of the moment. Antony placed a hand on Rochelle's back. Come with me, Rochelle. We have a lot to discuss, and you have a lot of changes to help me make. He guided her toward the elevators, which miraculously chimed and opened, as if the building itself was bowing to the new order. They stepped in, leaving the stunned engineering team to contemplate their regret in the ruins of their arrogance. The aftermath of the revelation transformed the company overnight. The following morning, the office felt different. The oppressive fog of fear was gone, replaced by a nervous but hopeful energy. Antony called an all-hands meeting in the main atrium. He stood on a stage, no longer in a jumpsuit but in a sharp navy suit, yet his demeanor remained accessible. Standing next to him, looking confident and professional, was Rochelle. The workplace romance whispered about wasn't one of lovers, but of a profound mentorship and shared vision. We are restructuring, Antony announced into the microphone, his voice echoing through the atrium. Titles don't matter anymore. True character matters. Contribution matters. The days of leading by fear are over. He turned to Rochelle, smiling proudly. Ms. James is no longer a junior analyst. As of this morning, she is my new partner and the vice president of engineering. She has full authority to clean house and rebuild this team. The room erupted in applause, genuine, thunderous applause this time. The staff who had been silenced, the unnoticed workers who had suffered under Sterling, cheered the loudest. The rich man poor woman gap was closed forever. She was now a rich woman, in power, in influence, and in spirit. Rochelle looked shocked by the volume of the support, but she stood tall. She had earned this, not because she played politics, but because she played fair. She will be leading the overhaul of the system, Antony continued. And she will be creating a new culture code. Point 1 where we help the janitor pick up a bucket. Not because he is the secret owner, but because he is a human being. He smiled at the crowd, his eyes twinkling. Because you never know who that janitor might be. And even if he is just a janitor, he deserves your respect. Rochelle took the microphone, her hands steady. She didn't speak with arrogance or vengeance. She spoke with the same kindness she had shown in the hallway. We have a lot of work to do, she said, her voice clear and inspiring. We are going to build something we can all be proud of. Let's do it together. The life lesson was complete. The undercover billionaire had found his heir, the guardian of his legacy. Antony stepped back, watching her lead, a sense of peace settling over him. He had saved his company from financial ruin, but more importantly, he had saved its soul from moral bankruptcy. He knew that as long as people like Rochelle were in charge, The legacy was safe. The regret of his absence was washed away by the hope of the future. As the meeting dispersed, Antony caught Rochelle's eye. He touched the brim of an imaginary cap, a silent salute to the janitor who had made it all possible. She smiled back, a dazzling expression of gratitude and strength. The unnoticed were finally seen, the judged were vindicated, and the company was finally whole again. Antony and Rochelle taught us a timeless truth today: the brightest diamonds are often hidden in the dust, and the loudest voices in the room are usually the emptiest. True power isn't found in the title on your business card, but in the kindness you show when you think no one is watching. If you're a part of the rare few who believe that integrity is worth more than a paycheck, and that a janitor deserves the same respect as a CEO, then you have found your tribe. Subscribe right now and join a community that refuses to judge a book by its cover. Let's send a message to the algorithm and the world. Hit that like button to prove that good character always has the last laugh. Comment below with your story. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true worth? I read every single comment. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that arrogance is a fragile shield, but kindness is armor. And don't let the inspiration stop here. Our channel is a deep vault of emotional journeys and vindication stories just like this one. Go explore our archives and discover the hidden treasures you've missed. They are waiting for you. And to ensure you aren't left behind when the next emotional roller coaster drops, turn on that notification bell. You definitely do not want to be late for the surprise we have coming next.